If you're familiar with some of my previous Call of Duty videos, then you've probably heard me mention Battlefield at least once or twice. For a while, these two franchises were basically head-to-head in full-blown competition. Some people like Call of Duty, and some people like Battlefield. Personally, I thought they both had their own merits, and I always enjoyed the Battlefield campaigns for what they had to offer, even when people told me that the only reason they existed was to prime people for the multiplayer. That being said, I've always thought that the Battlefield games had pretty good campaigns too. However, there's one game in the series that I personally feel has stood out a bit more over the years versus others due to the time period that it takes place. If it's not obvious by the title of this video, that game is Battlefield 1. Battlefield 1 is a first-person shooter developed by DICE with Electronic Arts as the publisher. The game was released as the 10th installment in the Battlefield series for the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and PC on October 21st, 2016. The game would release with a standard, an early enlister deluxe edition, and a collector's edition as well. As for what the early enlister deluxe edition was, this $79.99 edition was a version that allowed people to get the game on October 18th, so 3 days earlier. It also included the Red Baron and Lawrence of Arabia packs, which contained different themed weapons, vehicles, and items. There are also 5 battle packs containing items, as well as an alternative appearance for 3 large vehicles within the game. Additionally, the early Enlister Deluxe Edition also included a 7-day early access to a free map. And lastly, there was an exclusive Collector's Edition, which included 3 versions, either the Standard Edition, the previously mentioned early Enlister Deluxe Edition, or a version that didn't even come with the game at all, as it was something for people who had the intention of buying the game digitally. The Battlefield 1 Collector's Edition would come with a 14-inch statue, an exclusive steel book and a cloth poster, a deck of playing cards, a messenger pigeon tube with exclusive DLC content for the Doughboy M1911 pistol, an exclusive patch, and also premium packaging. It's also worth noting that the game would also have a number of multiplayer DLC expansions as well, all focusing on different aspects of World War I. However, since I don't really cover multiplayer, I wanted to at least make a brief mention since they're still one of the components of the game. The initial release of Battlefield 1 would also be met with praise, as the game would release to positive scores and would take home some awards, which included Best Action Game at the 2016 Game Critic Awards. The game had been a commercial success for Electronic Arts as well, with its most updated sales count being over 21 million as of December 2023. Now with all that out of the way, strap yourself in because it's time for a recap of Battlefield 1. If you don't want to listen to this part, feel free to skip to the provided timestamp. Set during World War I, Battlefield 1 begins with a dude in bed who has a flashback to the events of the war. The battle we see here is set in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in France. During this prologue, we're essentially taking control of different soldiers of the Harlem Hellfighters while attempting to hold the line. I'm not sure if it's possible to make it through this section without dying at all, but every death that you endure, you hear more narration occurring. The first death explains that the soldiers came from all over the world, thinking that the war would be like an adventure. However, it turned out to be the complete opposite. This leads to more combat and another eventual death, with narration happening, pretty much explaining that things like the tank changed combat. We then switch to a tank manning a cannon, taking out targets until eventually, boom, tank down. More narration happens here with the man explaining that instead of finding adventure, they found fear. This leads to us switching to someone else who puts on a gas mask as the air fills with a yellowish green smoke chemical with an objective to hold at all costs. This goes on until eventually some dude comes out of nowhere when a massive explosion happens. We then see a scene between soldiers who point their weapons at each other, and our narrator goes on saying that behind every soldier is a human being, introducing us to the war stories of Battlefield 1. The first real mission in Battlefield 1 begins with Through Mud and Blood. We learn here that it's late in the war and that the British Mark V tank is a fearsome war machine that can clear trenches and break through enemy defenses. However, it has a flaw in that it's not reliable. We also learn here about the preparation of the British forces' assault on the town of Cambrai before a scene occurs with us seeing some dude in a car look at his hands. This leads to a flash to the man, whose name is Daniel Edwards, now with bloodied hands in a war-torn area. This flashes again to another scene where a guy named Townsend gets Edward and brings him back to the tank, Black Bess. Edwards meets the crew, seeing some dudes named Finch and McManus. We learn here that the crew is to punch through German lines, then advance to the town of Cambrai. So this section of the campaign begins with a small tutorial where we drive to capture Piccadilly Mill. This portion of the level is pretty much just capturing points before we get this eventual scene when Bess is drilled with explosions. This leads to Finch going out to try and repair the tank along with Edwards. However, this leads to Finch getting killed, with Edwards being the one who goes and repairs the tank. Now back in the tank, we're tasked with destroying enemy artillery. This leads to a part where Bess eventually gets stuck in some mud as soldiers swarm the tank. This part has a dude named Pritchard dying while trying to send off a carrier pigeon with a message of the location of the tank for an artillery strike. Edwards gets a hold of the pigeon, however, and then sends it off, which leads us to flying the pigeon to HQ. After the pigeon successfully flies back to HQ, we see some soldiers blast the location of the tank, which initially looks like it's going to take out Bess.
Here it comes, boys. Nice serving with your lads.
But miraculously, the tank is able to survive the blast, so this leads to the crew starting Bess back up and then continuing on. However, Edwards is now tasked with leading the tank through Borland Wood since the area is too foggy to navigate. This section is pretty much Edwards going ahead and attacking camps, with Bess following up to finish the job. After this, Edwards returns to Bess, where we see them drive off to another area where it's now dark out. During this scene, Bess breaks down and we discover that it needs new spark plugs. Townsend has Edwards look to a nearby village where we see that it's occupied by enemy soldiers. This leads to McManus and Edwards leaving the tank. McManus here has a little freak out and then leaves, with Edwards having to go through the village to find spark plugs by himself. He does this and then returns to Bess. However, a soldier comes out of nowhere and attacks him. This leads to McManus coming out of nowhere and saving him. Edwards goes on and repairs the tank with a little dramatic scene where Bess doesn't initially start up. In the end, obviously, Bess does in fact start back up, which leads the crew to the objective of advancing through the village of Borland. They eventually get to Borland Rail Yard, where they go on to secure the area, with enemies beginning to swarm as they launch a counterattack. After all this is done, the crew's objective is to advance to the Cambrai rendezvous. However, we find out that Townsend is in rough shape. This leads to Bess getting blasted with artillery, with more soldiers coming out of nowhere.
Sorry, Bess.
So as you can see here, Townsend sacrifices himself to take out the enemy, blowing up Bess with Edwards and McManus as the only survivors, as we see this message pop up about more than 300 tanks having taken part in the Battle of Cambrai, with the war ending a month later, which ends through mud and blood. The next war story, Friends in High Places, sets the scene in Vosges, France, spring of 1917, where we learn that the Allies are losing the war in the air, with Britain struggling to compete with Germany's Air Force. The scene then goes on to show our protagonist here, Clyde Blackburn, gambling for a plane against a dude named George Rackham. Blackburn loses here, but we learn that he's taking the plane, which is a Bristol F2 anyways. Blackburn explains who he is, and then we see the Friends in High Places title. Blackburn goes on to introduce himself as George Rackham to a man named Wilson. The two then take off, and we get this little tutorial where we're essentially learning how to fly as well as fight. After this, enemy fighters appear, and then we're tasked with blowing them up. Once this is over, there's one more tutorial where we're to repair the aircraft before more enemies show up. We take them down and then chase after a straggler who tries to make an escape, which leads to Wilson and Blackburn coming across an enemy fortress holding munitions that they end up taking pictures of while being shot at. We learn here that these pictures would help HQ launch an assault. Initially reluctant to hand over the pictures at first, however, Wilson tells Blackburn that if he does this, then Blackburn has to promise to bring him home in one piece. Blackburn agrees, and then Wilson goes and hands over the pictures when we cut to the skies again, where we learn that Wilson and Blackburn's new mission is to clear bombers so they could blow up the fortress, along with some other objectives, like blowing up blimps and dropping anti-aircraft trucks before escorting the bombers when they arrive. After the blimps are downed and the AA trucks are gone, we see a little scene with the bombers showing up, and then we're tasked with protecting them from enemy planes so that they could blow up the fortress. After the final bombers go in and decimate the place, we get a scene with the Bristol being downed, which leads to Blackburn and Wilson crashing into no man's land. Blackburn here narrates in a little scene that Wilson didn't make it out, which leads to the section where we have to go through enemy territory to get to the British front. Eventually, Blackburn makes it to the trenches where he comes across Wilson, who had survived the crash.
Wilson, we're in no man's land. We need to go now.
I can't get up.
Shit.
Hey!
I'm sorry.
Will you promise to get me back in one piece?
Just keep it down.
What about medals? What about being heroes?
I'm no hero.
But you gave me your word. Your bleeding word. So you think you're a decent bloke who's gonna help me? Oh, you're lying.
So right here, Blackburn was about to leave behind Wilson, who tells him to instead finish the job. Moments away from bashing Wilson's face in, however, Blackburn's ruse is unveiled by him. This leads to Blackburn instead carrying Wilson back to friendly territory. After successfully getting back to the British front, we then see this scene with Blackburn being confronted by Rackham. Blackburn is then arrested, and we see this cut to him being handcuffed, with Wilson saying that he'll speak up for him. However, this is interrupted with sirens when George Rackham comes out of nowhere, telling Wilson that he needs a gunner. Blackburn tells Rackham that he'll do it. However, we see enemy planes fly in and kill Rackham, along with some other soldiers. This leads to Wilson freeing Blackburn from his handcuffs, as the two then take to the air, where they combat some enemy fighters. After this, we see a transition to some enemy bombers coming in, which leads to the new objective of dropping them. Once this is done, some enemy airships come in, and then we get tasked with blowing these things up too. Before we could finish the job here, however, Blackburn goes in and taunts an enemy gunner on the airship, which leads to their plane being shot down onto it. This leads to Blackburn and Wilson traveling across the top of the ship to seize the flat gun. Shortly after, however, a plane comes out of nowhere and rips across the top of the airship, which splits up Wilson and Blackburn, leaving the latter to traverse through the inside, fighting enemies alone. Blackburn eventually gets to the flat gun, dropping the gunner and taking a hold of the gun, blowing up some enemy planes and then shooting at an airship in the process before a soldier surprises him. Wilson then appears and starts beating up the soldier as the airship that Blackburn was shooting at bursts into flames and blows up.
Wow. What the hell? Wilson, we gotta go.
So with this scene, Wilson, Blackburn, and that random soldier dude jump off the ship. However, we only see Blackburn surface from the water, which leads us to question what happened to Wilson and the truthfulness of the story itself, which ends this section. And brings us to our next war story, Avanti Savoy. During the opening of this chapter, we learn about Italy and Austria-Hungary being deadlocked in the Alps, with an elite mountaineer regiment called the Arditi preparing an unorthodox assault. This section shows some dude named Luca reminiscing on some old war photos when his daughter mistakes his brother, Matteo, for him. He goes on to explain that his brother's battalion was sent to capture a fort in enemy territory, with his group, the Arditi, being tasked with a supportive role that was to assist Matteo's. During the first half of Avanti Savoy, we're pretty much heavily armored and well equipped. At the start, we're tasked with capturing St. Anastasia Church. After capturing the church, we then get a new objective to assault an artillery gun where we blow it up. Once this is finished, we We then go on to our next target, an anti-aircraft gun. Upon reaching the area, we get a scene where we see some enemy bombers approaching, which leads to Luca manning one of the AA guns and blowing stuff up before we see all sorts of mayhem. So Lucas survives this endeavor, seeing that the enemy had blown up the mountain as he takes off his armor, which leads us to the next part where he goes on to search for Matteo. Along the way, however, he comes across some allies and assists them in defending Alpini outpost. After the enemies are successfully repelled, Luca continues on searching for Matteo inside of a fort. However, the ending here isn't exactly a happy one. So Luca finds that Matteo had been killed, and then we see this picture of them together with a message popping up about empires collapsing after the war, with new countries being formed after, with the world and our view of it changing forever, which is the end of Avanti Savoy. This next war story, The Runner, we play as a guy named Frederick Bishop. During the opening of this story, we learn that spring of 1915 and that the British Empire has the intention of opening up a new front to the war with the invasion of the Ottoman homeland. This leads to a force being drawn up with soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, India, Newfoundland, France, and Britain, who all have the orders to land and march onto the capital of Constantinople. We then see our main dude, Bishop, being greeted by a kid named Jack Foster. We learn here that Jack lied about his age to get past conscription, and then him and Foster go on to this part where we begin the section by directing a dreadnought barrage. After the booms, Bishop goes off, telling Jack that he's only to move when he directs a signal flare. This leads us with the objective of storming the beach and securing some trenches. Once we capture the point, Bishop sends up a flare, seeing that Jack was right behind him. Bishop scolds Jack here before giving him some tips on shooting guns. The next scene shows Bishop and Jack being split up, with Bishop now being sent to get a report from the front line. Once he gets a report, he returns back and helps with defending the commander's outpost, after which, going on to locate Whitehall. We then see this scene with Jack saving Bishop from an enemy. This leads to Bishop explaining to Whitehall that the lines are falling before he's tasked with telling Rear Command that they're moving up. This leads to Bishop going on to investigate Rear Command, seeing a note that explains that Allied position had been lost and artillery fire was ordered to cover a retreat to the beach. Bishop then rushes off to warn the front line of British artillery fire. Finding Whitehall at the front line, he assists in defending the location from the enemy. Once this is accomplished, Bishop relays the message from the note to Whitehall. However, he's told by Whitehall that a group of men, including Jack, had been sent to secure a fort, which was one of the locations that was about to be targeted for shelling. Bishop then goes on to Fort No Bay, finding Jack and a bunch of other soldiers holed up at the gate. Bishop explains that the place was about to be bombed, but Jack says that they can't leave because their wounded wouldn't be able to outrun the enemy. Bishop then says that he'll cover their escape by making it look like that he's going to capture the fort, also going on to say that he'll make his own escape once he sees the flares from Jack. This leads to Bishop going on to reach the top of Fort No Bay, where he captures a courtyard. After this, Bishop gets shot, dropping his attacker as he falls to the ground. Looking out to the waters, he sees Jack's flare go off when we see shelling begin, when the screen cuts to a message about fighting continuing for 9 months, with the Ottoman holding on to Gallipoli, which also ends the Runner war story. In the last story, we see the scene set in the Mesopotamia in spring of 1918, with tribes rebelling against the Ottoman Empire, who counters them by deploying their most advanced technology. This is followed by a message saying that T. Lawrence was working with the rebels, where we see a scene with the narrator talking about how the Ottoman Empire controlled the Arabian desert for more than 400 years. However, small bands of rebels would go on to unite in an attempt at overthrowing them, with the narrator saying that Lawrence of Arabia would work with them when we see the title of the war story, Nothing is Written. During this opening section, we play as a woman named Zara who's overlooking a derailed Ottoman train. She goes on to enter the train, finding a codebook inside. After this, a cutscene happens where Zara's confronted by some enemies, which includes a man named Tilkiki, when Lawrence comes out of nowhere and saves the day. Tilkiki then asks who Zara is, which prompts her to give him a punch to the jaw before we learn about the intentions of the Empire.
Free, is it? You'll be free when you're dead. And I'm happy to tell you The Empire intends to grant you all this freedom very soon. Even now, an engine of destruction scours this desert, obliterating your allies, your families, your homes. Soon there will be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Soon all that you know, and all that you love, will be ashes. You will all be free to die.
Zara follows this up by cutting the side of the dude's face and then asks him how they could lure the train to destroy it. Tilkiki explains that it would be impossible, stating that they would need communication codes, something that they already have. Tilkiki then freaks out and gets taken away when we see the next section of the story, where we learn that we need to go into a bunch of heavily defended strongholds and send out 3 fake messages via messenger pigeons. Zara does all this, however, after hitting the last stronghold, she's stopped by Tilkiki, who knocks her out. This leads to a scene with him dragging Zara into the desert, where he tells her that the messages with the locations of Lawrence's camp had already been sent for the Ottomans' train to attack. Zara catches Tilkiki off guard and then drops him and rushes off, seeing the aftermath of destruction in the distance. We find that Lawrence was able to survive the attack, however, and we see them come up with a plan to destroy the Ottomans' train. This leads to a section where Zara is tasked with destroying Ottoman vehicles. Once this is done, we learn about the rebels setting a trap to lure the Ottoman train. This leads to a scene where we see it heading full speed when Zara sets off an explosion where we see a new objective of destroying the train. After the thing goes boom, we get one last scene with Lawrence and Zara where Lawrence says that they need to think bigger, asking Zara what she knows about battleships, followed by a message popping up saying that after the Great War, the Ottomans were driven from Arabia, with Lawrence remaining a controversial figure and the war for oil continuing to this day, which ends Nothing is Written, and begins one final scene.
One day, all this will be over. The war to end all wars will be won by one side or the other. The guns will rust, grass will grow, and there'll be nothing left of any of this. The land will heal itself, as everything does in the end. We'll be long gone by then, but maybe not forgotten. History only remembers 1 in 1,000 of us. Then the future will be filled with stories of who we were and what we did, how we lived, how we fought, and how we died. When this is all over and the war is won, they will remember us. But until that day comes, we will stand. We will look death in the eye, and we will fight.
And that, my friends, is Battlefield 1. Summarizing my thoughts on the campaign of Battlefield 1, I'll just say that I liked it. I'm not a history expert, so I can't really tell you all the time period accuracy of the game, but from what I've seen, the game itself is fictional. However, the events in the game itself are actually real. I'll just say that I'm not exactly a history expert, so I can't really say much about anything other than the game itself, which I at least felt was a solid experience. I mean, like any game, there's some issues, sure, but I believe that the 5 or so hours that I spent playing were pretty fun. There were some missions that I thought were kind of repetitive, but what can you do? The game starts with Storm of Steel, which is just a prologue to get you acclimated with the game. It's okay, a good way to introduce the player to the setting, but then you got 5 other war stories, each with their own unique characters. My favorite war stories were probably Through Mud and Blood and Friends in High Places. Maybe it was because it was a nice change of pace to drive around in a tank or even fly around, but I found these to be the most interesting sections. They both have their own little sections where you run around on foot too, but the highlight was really being in vehicles. The Runner and Avanti Savoia were okay too. They were both pretty short short, so nothing really to complain about. That being said, I thought the runner had a more interesting narrative out of the two. I'd also say nothing is written was alright as well. I thought that the train fight was kind of a good mix-up after what I thought was kind of a meh part where you're just sending off pigeons. So I have to say, I also found this war story to be the most difficult. I didn't really die a lot on the other campaigns, but this one had me going. Now, if you've played a Battlefield game before, you'll probably know what you're getting into with the gameplay side of things, or at least have an idea. I have to admit, the last Battlefield that I played was Hardline, which honestly felt a lot different than a lot of Battlefield 1. This is primarily due to the game's campaign being split up more. There's no centralized focus on a singular character or villain. Instead, we're shown multiple storylines with different characters and their experiences in World War I. However, I will say that the game still provides a lot of entertainment value. You have horseback stuff, tank battles, dogfights, and sections where you can approach battlefields using either stealth or just run and gun. There's a non-linear element to completing objectives, something that I do like the aspect of, though there's certain things that kind of feel off. Take, for example, the beginning level where you're controlling the tank. Now, what's the first thing that you notice here? Is it the enemies rushing in? Is it the pretty graphics? Or is it this capturing flag objective? It's only one section of this part of the campaign, but it really did suck the immersive feelings from my bone in what is essentially the Conquest multiplayer game mode. There's a few other parts like this in the campaign as well, and it feels weird every time you see it. Is it the worst thing ever? By all means, no. But it really does feel a little off, because the rest of the storyline and objectives are actually pretty solid otherwise. I also have to say that I'm a fan of this little leaning cover aim in Battlefield 1. I've honestly been playing Stalker 2 recently, and that game has something similar to this. I also think I mentioned before that this was something in Call of Duty Ghosts as well. I know it's something small, but I wanted to make a mention of this because it's such a nice feature, and I don't think it should be glossed over because it's a super beneficial one in first-person shooters, and I feel like it should be in all of them. What I'll also say is that the guns in the game feel beast. There was this one section where I picked up a tank-aware rifle, and I absolutely swear to you, every shot of this gun made me feel like I was firing a freaking cannon. The gun felt like it had more oomph to it than the 50 cal from Call of Duty. This thing is so beastly that it could blow up tanks too. If it seems overpowered, I believe that it's actually balanced for its damage capability, at least since you can only fire it while you're on the ground. I would actually say that most of the guns in Battlefield 1 feel good either way, so I can't really pinpoint any specific one that I felt was bad, except maybe the pistols. This was the closest thing to an inconvenience, and since you had the ability to hold two rifles, it was like, why would you want to pick up a pistol when there's way cooler weapons? In terms of the game's looks and feels and sounds and everything, I'd say that DICE did a phenomenal job with the campaign maps. One of my favorite sections of any level was actually going through No Man's Land during the Friends in High Places storyline. This part of the game was exactly how I pictured World War I based on limited knowledge, so it was interesting to see how they tackled this element. I did like the visual effects of grime that would appear on guns and some of the weather that appeared during certain missions. It was all incredibly stunning and really helped with the immersive factor in the game when you went through levels and noticed all these little details that help you appreciate the game just a bit more. The other thing with the Battlefield games is that you also have destructible environments. There's a couple times where I found myself perched in high places where I got knocked down after my little lookout got blown away, which I have to admit kind of made me laugh. I also had fun doing some of my own renovation, specifically during levels where you had the tank. I don't know why, but firing at buildings and watching them crumble was fascinating to watch, especially if you come off of games where that's not a thing. I'd say everything else is fine. The music's okay, not my favorite, but it has its moments, and all the vehicles and whatnot sound fine too. The guns have a very raw sound to them as well. I can appreciate everything from firing to reloading guns here more after playing a few recent games where gunfire sounded almost muddy in a way. But in Battlefield 1, most weaponry and even stuff like explosives sound a lot more crisp. The voice acting is also sufficient. A lot of it makes the game come off like a narrated war movie. I don't think there's really any performances I could handpick as stuff that blew me away by any means. So I guess if I had to pick one, I personally thought Clyde Blackburn was the most interesting due to him feeling more mysterious, as in the beginning, he's impersonating someone else. He's just kind of a dude who's kind of just there, which I thought made him stand out amongst the others a lot more. So the last thing to look to is what kind of flaws do I feel the game has? Apart from the game's short length, which is literally like a 4 to 5 hour campaign. I say 4 to 5 because I died a bunch and I'm sure that someone else could finish this game a lot faster than me. I feel like even this is something a little nitpicky here, friends. There's honestly a lot that I like about Battlefield 1, but I guess if I had to say anything, it would be that I really hate these sections with multiplayer-esque objectives. They just feel like weird time padding, and I'm not necessarily a fan of them. Everything else, however, is fine, I'd say. I mean, yeah, even if some of the historical accuracies are a bit fabricated, I have to reiterate that I still think this is a good game. But anyways, that's really all I had to say for Battlefield 1. It's a good game that provides a lot of entertainment value for what it is and what it does, and there's a lot of variety to it at that. If you're looking at just playing through the campaign, you might be a little underwhelmed by things like the length, but the multiplayer of Battlefields tends to be a good time, so that might make it worth it more for someone who wants to at least try the game online, since there's still an active base that exists playing the game's multiplayer. I'd also give praise towards the game's setting too. We don't really see a lot of media revolving around the First World War, so at least having some exposure to it is certainly a breath of fresh air in some ways. And even if there was some liberties taken, I at least found it to be enjoyable enough to gloss over issues that others might find to be immersion breaking. Either way, Battlefield 1 is a solid entry and one worth diving into. Thank you all for watching. Bit of a change of pace here, but I wanted to switch it up. I'm curious what everyone's thoughts are on Battlefield 1 as well. Did you like it, or was it not up to your speed? Feel free to leave a comment, and also like and subscribe as well if you already haven't. We'll be back with more soon, so until next time, peace out.